One of perhaps the weirdest things you encounter when reading a lot of food news and research studies and things of that nature is this consistent, for several years now, attack on eating red meat because it's a sign of masculinity. That's really weird. This is a very strange thing. And you see this happen all the time. Really, if you just do a simple Google search of red meat and masculinity, and you're going to see articles every several months in major news outlets talking about how it's a big problem that eating red meat is a sign of masculinity. Ladies, I know there are a fair number of you in the audience here. I'm going to ask, do you see eating red meat as a sign of masculinity? Do you feel yourself more masculine? Is it because you ate red meat? Personally, I never found that as, as an adult man, I never felt that way, that eating red meat was more masculine. In fact, in, younger days, a few years ago, looking back on how I used to eat when I was doing, just more clean keto, weight loss protocols. I was eating more chicken than anything else when it came to meat. I was getting my fat from quote unquote healthy animal or plant fat-based fat sources, mostly avocado and olive oils and things. And I never felt more masculine when I ate red meat. I wished it was more cheaper because it tasted better, but I was eating a lot of chicken because it was an easy, cheap source of protein, and I got good gains with it at the gym. So it didn't matter. But masculinity never crossed my mind. To this day, masculinity never crosses my mind when eating red meat. Yet it seems that this is a underlying sort of concern for those pushing for plant-based foods. And I think that's a really big tell on their part, actually, because you may have noticed that masculinity is one of those things the broader culture just doesn't like much right now. That, or at least the movers and shakers in the broader culture don't seem to like masculinity. There's an attempt to really undermine masculinity for a number of reasons, none of which make any sense on the surface unless you really get deep into tinfoil hat stuff. And it really does kind of beg a question why they're doing it. But they're using perceptions at best that eating red meat is masculine to really push their program. And, I found a study here that none of the carnivore voices who do talk about the sort of food meets culture stuff that I like to do, none of them ever talked about this. And here's a study from this year, from about 6 months ago, actually 8 months ago, from the journal called Appetite, which I've never heard of that journal before, but it is a peer-reviewed journal. And the title of this article is The Impact of Masculinity Stress on Preferences and Willingness to Pay for Red Meat. I'll just read you the abstract here. This work explores the effects of masculinity stress, distress arising from a perceived discrepancy with male gender norms, on red meat consumption, which has potentially substantial individual, collective, and ecological consequences. Across 3 studies, we demonstrate a positive indirect effect of masculinity stress on red meat consumption. This occurs through beliefs that meat consumption can augment masculinity, an effect which is moderated by one's self-assessed traditional masculinity. So you have a self-assessment here on how masculine the person feels. There's your first red flag. We further demonstrate the attenuation of the effect of masculinity stress on red meat preference when a red meat product is associated with an out group, meaning women. Okay, so there's your second red flag. Men don't think that way, I'm sorry. And show that this effect does not extend to women. In study 3, we show that the effect of masculinity stress on choice of red meat is attenuated following a masculinity affirmation. We finish with a detailed discussion of implications and directions for future research. Taken together, we provide convergent evidence that masculinity stress is associated with red meat preference, and that this preference can be discouraged by leveraging outgroup reference information and masculinity information. In so doing, this research provides a series of contributions to the literature on meat eating and vegetarianism specifically, as well as gender identity maintenance more broadly. Okay, so I presented you an article yesterday, I think, on how there's, red meat's worse for men than it is women. And the journalist who shared this on Twitter, he was going on a tirade about because the journalist who wrote that for The Guardian, I went for The Guardian yesterday, went on a tirade about how masculine being plant-based is, showing how the strongest man in the world is apparently vegan, Patrick Bubamane, and I probably didn't say his name right, and how masculinity is, or the dirty, gross version of masculinity, the distorted versions of masculinity are never far from the red meat debate. It's there is an underlying deep concern these people have with masculinity, and I don't know what it is, and I almost wonder if that's actually the real thing that they're concerned about, because typically these research studies don't actually make a heck of a lot of sense. This red meat will destroy you. Just it doesn't stand up under scrutiny because all these people claim to come from a scientific worldview, and yet at the end of the day, the science tells us that human beings have eaten red meat in large quantities, as much as we could get our hands on, for pretty much all of our history, and they were fine. So I don't know what's going on here, but I really do think it's something else, because, and I think that they're going after masculinity is the key here, because you may have noticed in the broader culture in other areas outside of food, masculinity is something that is getting frowned on more and more by the opinion makers. And that should be concerning to everybody. In the same way that femininity, if that were being gone after and undermined and trying to be replaced with something else or made to seem to be bad, if that was going on, you should be concerned about that too. It's just using red meat is ridiculous for this, because it's pretty clear red meat's actually good for you. Super nutrient dense, it's satiating. Our bodies love the saturated fat. When you start getting into large amounts of polyunsaturated fats or the artificial fats made in the lab, hydrogenated oils and things, you start getting problems. One thing our bodies don't like are processed foods, and again, people don't talk about that much. So instead, they look for ways to reduce your red meat consumption. And so they give you positive reinforcement on your masculinity when you choose a plant-based option. Like this George Monbiot guy who wrote the article I went over from The Guardian earlier this week, when he tells you, oh, in case you're wondering, Patrick Bubamane is the strongest man in the world and he's vegan. Okay, I wonder what else he's using, and if that would undermine his claims to being vegan. It's just food for thought, I think. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It really does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot as well. I'm Anthony Stine, Practical Carnivore. Thanks for watching.